Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second webinar for the Sprint grants. These are the State Park Revitalization and Investment in Notable Tourism Grants, or commonly called the Sprint grants. My name is Bridget Jobe, and I am the Director for Kansas Tourism. And before I introduce our speaker today, I want to mention a couple of items to you. Today's webinar is going to be focused on some of the most commonly asked questions about the Sprint grant program. If you did miss the first webinar, that recording can be found at kansascommerce.gov/sprint. And there's a ton of other information about that grant, this grant on that page, and I encourage you to go back and watch that. Also, if you have questions throughout the webinar today, we're going to ask that you put them into the chat and we will go through them after the presentation. If you have a very specific question that only pertains to your very specific project, I encourage you to reach out by email, and we'll have all those emails for you as we go through the presentation today. But we want to keep the questions pretty general that you put into the chat. So to get us started, I would like to introduce Jonathan Clayton, who is the Director of Economic Recovery for the Department of Commerce. Jonathan, take it away.
Thank you, Bridget. I appreciate the introduction. And yes, just to reiterate, today we'll be discussing those commonly or frequently asked questions about the Sprint grant. If you haven't had a chance to, please make sure that you go and watch the first webinar and read through the guidelines on the program at kansascommerce.gov/sprint. That will allow you to get more information about the program, the eligible uses, the time frame, all of the information that's kind of the basics of the program. But today is really focused on those questions that we've been receiving that we want to try to clarify anything. I know we had some questions that we couldn't get answered last time, and hopefully we've been able to get those researched for you and make that available. So we will just kind of go through here. Again, this is just who I am. I'm Director of Economic Recovery. I work with the Spark funds as well as legislative ARPA funds for the Department of Commerce. I also apply for and administer ARPA funding throughout the U.S., primarily from the EDA for the state of Kansas, and as well as technical assistance, support, and guidance for local entities and regional applications for ARPA-related funding. Today's session will be recorded and will be available within the next day or two at the same website, kansascommerce.gov/sprint, as well as the slides. So you'll be able to review those if you need to refer back for any questions you might have on your application. So for today's discussion, we'll go through the grant timeline again, just so everyone's clear on that. We'll discuss some of those FAQs that we've received and some answers we have for you. We'll also take a moment to go through the application online, as well as the sample budget document that was provided. And then if we have time at the end, we'll take some additional questions that are hopefully general to the program. But if you have, as Bridget mentioned, very specific questions to your application, we invite you to provide those to our email address, commercespark@ks.gov. And I'll have that email address up here on the screen at the end, so you can jot that down if you need to. So we'll go right into our discussion on the timeline. So this is our timeline for the Sprint grant from the moment awards are announced and going forward. So we're looking at an award announcement date of April 3rd or later. It may be a few days after that, just depending on the amount of applications coming in. We are expecting quite a significant amount since we've had such a strong interest in the webinars and the emails and the questions we've been receiving. We expect to have a lot of interest in applications for this program. So moving down the timeline, if you look at June 1st, that is when we are expecting to provide you with your first disbursement. So if you recall, you'll be receiving no fewer than 2 disbursements on your award. You may it may be split up into more than 2, but on average we'll have 2 disbursements, 50% each. Your first one will come after your award agreement is signed, and we have all of that documentation. Afterwards, you'll have your first quarterly report that will be due on July 31st. All quarterly reports will be submitted through the same submittable portal, and those will be required 1 month after each quarter closes. And in those reports, you'll be submitting your evidence of documented expenditures, proof of payment, so your canceled checks, voided or canceled checks or bank statements, as well as any of those invoices or purchase orders that they are tied to. You'll be doing that each quarter until you finish your project or the 2 years expires. Your next quarterly report will take place, be due by October 31st. And then after that, we'll be processing those reports and then trying to get all of your second disbursements out by the 1st of next year. So again, keep that in mind when you're putting your budget together. You don't want to estimate more than 50% of your total award to be dispersed during 2023, and the remaining disbursement to come as soon as possible at the beginning of 2024. Moving farther, much farther down the line, if you are still working on your project, your last quarterly report will be due April 30th of 2025, as well as all of your final grant expenditures. So every receipt that has to come in for the first quarter of 25, that report's due April 30th. That's also the last day to make any other expenditures, which goes into Q2. So you'll have a Q2 report for 1 month. That's also going to double as your closeout report. That will be due July 31st of 2025. If just to reiterate as well, if you do have questions, please make sure and put those in the chat function, and Bridget and I will get to those as soon as we can, whenever we have a moment at the end of the presentation. So we're going to get into the FAQs. This is probably the most frequently asked question we received at all, just because it was somewhat unclear when we discussed this last time, but I want to really make sure that this is very clear for all of our applicants. So the question is, my city or county received ARPA funds, am I eligible to apply? So the answer is generally yes. I want you to think about in terms of, there are 2 main buckets of funding from ARPA. One is called the local fiscal fund. Those went directly to the cities and counties, and nearly every one of them got at least 2 tranches or two disbursements from that. Those are not the same as the state fiscal recovery funds. Those state fiscal recovery funds are like your base grant, the higher education funds that were provided by the legislature last year. If you are of a city entity that received one of those, and not just an entity within the city, but the actual city organization itself, or that higher education institution, if you received these fundings, that would make you ineligible for the Sprint grant. But if it's just a general local fiscal recovery fund disbursement that you receive directly from ARPA, that does not disqualify you. So I hope that answers the question. The Sprint grant is from the same bucket of funding as the base grant and the higher ed funds, and that is the state fiscal recovery. So we want to make sure those are separate. State fiscal recovery is not eligible if you received one already. Local fiscal recovery does not make you ineligible. All right, next question, is SAM.gov registration required? Yes, it is. You are required to have the UEI, that unique entity identification number, as part of registration in order to receive your funding. You are asked to provide that in your application, but it is not required at this time. You will need it in order to receive your award and have your award agreement signed. So if you don't have it for now, you can enter TBD in the required field for the UEI number, and that will be sufficient for now. If you get the UEI number later, we'll get that from you when we need it after we make the awards. Can I use grant funds or matching funds to purchase furniture, small equipment, or other equipment for my facility? So we don't actually have matching funds. Again, we had a lot of people asking what the matching funds were. We don't have a matching fund requirement for this. But to answer the general question, those equipment and installations inside of your facility that are permanently installed, that aren't movable, that aren't removed from the facility or can't easily be removed without some sort of other certified licensed professional or a lot of work. Those equipments that are fixed and permanently installed can be used with these grant funds. You cannot use these funds for your furniture, for fixtures that are removable, for things that aren't necessarily a part of the facility on a long-term basis. That also includes any kind of transportation vehicle, golf carts, vans, anything that's part of the facility. Those cannot be part of your application as well. Do I need to go out to bid to get the estimates for my application? No, that's not required at this stage. So for your application, if you have estimates from a contractor or an engineer, those will stand. Those will be sufficient for the documentation on your application to show where your dollars are coming from and why you're asking for a certain amount. If you are awarded, you will be required to go out to bid and have a competitive process for any project aspect that exceeds $5,000 or more, unless your organization has a stricter spending threshold. So if you have a procurement policy that requires $2,500 instead of $5,000, you'll have to stick to the $2,500. That's the most stringent. If you are awarded at that time between you get your award letter and your award agreement, that's when we come in and ask for all of the other documentation. You'll need to start your bidding process. You won't have to have it completed, but you'll need to start it. So we'll need to get a copy of that procurement policy, the bid that goes out, or the notice for the bid, excuse me, any responses that are received, the method of determination for how you chose that contractor or engineer or architect, and then the copy of the final contract for all this, for any service or vendor that comes in at 5,000 or more. Next question was also very commonly received. What if I already have an architect or engineer on contract for my project? Will I have to find a new one for the grant? So the answer is not necessarily. If your existing architect or engineer was obtained in a competitive manner, so back when you hired that architect, if you did the bid process for them, you will be allowed to maintain that contract as long as that contract includes the scope of work that's included within your grant request. So for example, you hired an engineer, you went out to bid, you found the best one, and in that engineer's contract are phases 1 through 10 of your project. If your grant request is for phases 2 through 4, then that's covered in the scope of work, and that architect can stay on with that contract. However, if your grant request was for, say, phases 11, 12, 13, you will need to go out to bid for that architect. You can use the same one again. You can also use the same engineer or architect that provided you with quotes for your application. That architect or engineer can be used whenever you go out to bid after an award is made. So that is permitted. If you are going to keep that same contractor or architect or engineer, and you've already got that contract in place and it was done through a competitive manner, and you can show that the scope of work is all inclusive of the grant, you'll be allowed to basically complete some more paperwork, which we're all very used to by now. And we'll approve that on a case-by-case basis. We'll have to take some time to review to make sure that it does check off all of the steps, but we'll go through that. And then once we've got that approved, we'll issue you a written authorization to proceed with that existing contract. Can my application include a request for purchasing property? Yes. So real estate purchases, either land or buildings, are allowed, but they are limited to 50% of the full grant request. So for example, if you have a grant request of $2 million, you can only budget $1 million for the purchase of a building or land. You can't exceed that with your application. If you do, we won't nullify it, but we will reduce the amount of eligible funds that you could draw down from your application, from your award, excuse me. Can I use previously allocated and expended funds as part of my funding request? So the answer is yes. If your application consists of a project that is still in progress, And you may request funds for expenditures dating back to July 1st of 2022. That was not a typo. That is allowed on our project, on our program, as long as you have documented proof of those expenses. So when you send in your application, there's a section for bids and estimates. And in that section, if you are going to request reimbursement for expenditures dating back to that July 1st date, you need to provide those in that bids and estimates section. If you have more than the allowable limit on the attachments, you'll need to combine those into PDFs or files that will prove that you've got all those in order. We can only provide the funds and approve an application if the documentation is there for those previous expenditures. As well, for your future costs that you might have going down the road on your application, if you're going to request $2 million, we need to see in writing and documented evidence of quotes or estimates to show that you have $2 million in actual expenditures. So those estimates can be combined, they can be added in with previous, you can do a combination of both, but they all need to add up to whatever the dollar amount is that you're requesting. What if I want to renovate an existing property that is on the state or national historic registry? So you do not have to concern yourself with that at this time. It's not another step we're asking you to do for the application. If you are selected for an award, you will need to obtain written permission from the Kansas State Historic Preservation Office, or we call it SHPO, before you will be issued an award agreement or any funding from this program. And basically, if you've never done that before, you will have already your bids and estimates and your narrative that's provided to us. We will then submit that on your behalf to SHPO for the work that needs to be done to properly complete the grant. SHPO requires 30 days to review, and once they do review, they'll either send back an approval or a request for more information. But that's not something you have to concern yourself with now. That will come later after an award is made. Am I required to use the budget template provided on the Sprint Grant webpage? No, you are not. It is there. It is a helpful tool. It allows you to submit both a budget and a timeline from one document, and you can just use them both for your budget section and your timeline section. But you can use any format that best suits for you for your project. You do not have to use it, but it is definitely there for you as a tool. Here is our other big confusing question from last time. Are city and county parks eligible to apply? So the answer is that city and county entities may apply for government-owned tourism locations, but local parks are not eligible unless there is a regional tourism focused economic development in place, such as a specific tourist destination and not a community attraction or facility that services local memberships like a pool. So what would be permitted in this instance would be, for example, in a park, if you have the desire to build a permanent structure that is for economic development. And by that, it means, is it going to be drawing in funds for the city, either through the tourism that comes in, you're charging fees, for example, like an amphitheater or a permanently installed stage, that would be permitted. Now, I hope I'm not going to confuse anyone else on this. We discussed zoos last time as well. Zoos are separate from parks. They cannot be within a city park. They have to be a separate entity geographically from a park to be eligible. But those installations that can go inside of a park, those would be permitted. Should I submit multiple projects or combine them into one larger request? So it's recommended that you submit a project that has the largest impact to your area. If that's going to be one large project that covers the city or areas that you can specifically show that are tourism related, and that does not mean a tourism site on one side of town and a restaurant on the other side of town. That's not something that we're able to approve. But if you have a historic district, for example, that has in itself, out of itself, a historic value and brings in tourism because of the history of the district, that's something that can be permitted. However, you've got to make sure that within that district, you are applying for the proper uses of the funds, and it's not going to be for those furniture or anything that's, you know, non-permanent and involved in that. It also really, you really have to make your case in that instance that it is tourism based and it's not just an ad hoc request for buildings that need repair. You really have to show that your district, in that example, provides tourism dollars to the city. And if you've got multiple, you know, venues within one organization, say for example, a museum on one side of town and an event venue maybe a couple of blocks away, you can do that as an application, a combined application. You don't have to. It's also a very unlikely, it's not impossible, but it's unlikely that more than one application will be awarded per city. So it might be a case where some of our larger cities, but if you are in a medium-sized, small or medium-sized city in the state, it's unlikely that we'll be able to make more than one award per city. So keep that in mind. If you do have more than one application, you very well could be competing against yourself, and you're going to want to show which one's your priority. Does the grant provide all or nothing funding, and can my award be reduced? So if a portion of your project is considered ineligible, or if funds are limited in the overall program, we can still award you with a lesser amount of funding than requested. If we do that, it will be your decision as an entity on where those cuts will take place. We're not going to tell you that if you give us a 3-phase project for 2 million and we cut it down to 1 million, that you will have the right as the applicant to make those changes on your own budget at a later time after we get to the award phase of where those cuts are going to go. You could just reduce it down to say phase 1 instead of phase 1 through 3. You could split everything and just reduce everything by half. It's what can get done in the 2-year period of time that we will work with you afterwards to get that budget revised. And the last question, is there a scoring matrix for the applicants to review? So that's coming. I'm hopeful to have that by the end of this week, and it'll be on that kansascommerce.gov/sprint webpage. And it should be up, definitely will be up before the end of the application period, but my goal is to have that up for you all by the end of this week, so you can take a look at what sections are weighted on what certain levels. And you know what's important, of course, is your documentation for your bids and estimates, your documentation for your budget and your timeline, everything showing what kind of impact you have, how thorough your narrative and scope of work are, and where all of that fits in together. All of those things are going to be given a scored value based off the category. So right now we'll take a moment and go through some questions. We'll see if we've got some here through on the chat.
We did, Jonathan. Yeah, there were several. Do you want me to kind of read them to you to kind of sort them through here?
Yeah, go ahead, Bridget. There's a couple that I've got that I know I can answer, but go ahead. We're just going to go down the list here.
Okay, yeah. There was a question on the procurement regulations, and you may have answered this one about the 2 CFR Part 200.
Sure. So 2 CFR Part 200, for those of you who have never had any interaction with federal requirements for procurement and open and fairness to prevent waste, fraud, and abuse, that's what those regulations discuss. So I have a slide here, and I can go back to it as well. It talks about needing the bids beforehand. That's a portion of it. So that talks about the openness and fairness of having a competitive bid process for the work that needs to be done with the federal funds. It also requires that when we also talked about having that existing contractor, we need to do a sole source justification. That's the process of ensuring you have all of that. Other parts of that large federal regulation include if you have policies in place for conflict of interest, to make sure that no one on your board or your organization is receiving a profit from these grants. If you have a proper grant management policy, Those are not requirements in order for you to get the grant, but we will have to have you follow all of those requirements if you are awarded. So if, for example, in your risk assessment questions, if you check the boxes for conflict of interest policy and grant management policy, but you might not have a procurement policy in place, we will assist you with that later to make sure that you are compliant. It's our duty as the state to make sure that all of our subawards are compliant with the federal regulations. So we'll go through that very, very carefully with all of the awardees after it's made.
There's a couple of questions on the bidding. Somebody wanted to confirm bidding for contracts does not need to be completed by the time the funding is awarded, but completed before they can have authorization to spend. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. So yeah, the bidding doesn't need to take place now. The bidding can take place after an award is made. Right now, just getting an estimate from a contractor or an engineer, that will suffice. You don't need to go out to bid right now.
And what if they only receive one bid after following all of the guidelines?
That's very likely to happen, especially in some of our more rural areas where engineers and contractors are hard to come by. So if only one bid comes in, that's acceptable. We just need to see that in writing for you to provide us with, all the same information, the notice of the bid, and then the response that came in. If you do want to accept that one bid that does come in, you are permitted to do so. We just need to see all the documentation for that.
There's a question about when you were talking about the furniture notes. Would improvements to audio or visual elements to a museum be eligible?
Generally, yes, as long as those are permanently installed fixtures. So, for example, projectors that are mounted onto the ceiling, speaker enhancements that are added into an auditorium that are permanently installed, or even if they're movable somewhat, that is permitted, yes.
So talking about the 50% limits, would adding on to an existing building be limited to that 50% of the awarded amount as well, if they're adding on to a building?
Generally, no, unless you were buying, like, let's say if that building was on one plot of land, you had to buy a second plot to build on and extend it. The purchase of that second plot would be limited to 50%, but the construction of an additional or an addition to a building that's still on your property and you don't have to buy additional property to do that, that is not capped. Now, if you are buying another building next to you so you can move in and expand, that is limited. But just by constructing an additional part of your facility, that is not capped on the 50%.
Would an upgrade to an existing playground park be eligible?
No, it would not.
Okay, how final do the design plans need to be for the site and building construction? Is a conceptual plan acceptable?
Yes, it is. We know that trying to get an architect or an engineer to get any kind of final plans in this short window is not possible all the time. So contingent or draft plans are perfectly allowed.
There was a question on the scoring, and I think you addressed that a little bit. I think if you have any more specific questions on that, you might want to reach out to Jonathan directly. We have a couple of people who are looking at attraction development grants through Kansas Tourism or HEAL grants in addition to Sprint. Would Sprint funding exclude them from getting the other two?
In terms of the federal spending and the dollars provided to each program, no. But that actually will be Bridget's decision whether or not she wants to allow those who are awarded the Sprint grant to also be awarded attraction development grant. That's handled directly and only with the Department of Tourism, and I have no involvement in that.
And I would answer for the attraction development, it would not exclude you if you received Sprint funding, but I will say that all of these grants are very competitive. And so the likelihood of receiving both is probably fairly slim unless there are not a lot of applicants. But typically there are so many, it is very competitive. but I encourage everyone to apply for all of them. Is an engineer or GC contract required to apply?
Not necessarily. No, it's not required. And you definitely don't have to have them under contract to apply. You will, though, need to have some sort of documentation for your estimates and quotes and bids, however that comes in. So again, they don't have to be under contract, but you do need to have documented evidence of your requests for funds based off of estimates and quotes from some sort of provider, other than just guessing yourself.
If they are a zoo that's not affiliated with a government entity, are they, what organization type are they? Entertainment venue, other tourism focused business? What would you suggest?
They can use the other tourism focused business. That would be perfectly fine.
We have a foundation that is applying with an association with the city or county entity. Can they follow the grant guidelines of the city county? Is there a conflict of interest there?
Yes, so they can use that. They can use those guidelines that are provided from the city. And when they check those questions on there to say, yes, we do have a conflict of interest policy or a grant management policy, that foundation, because if they are partnering with them, and probably the best way to show that is one, in your narrative, and two, a letter of support from that city or county entity to recognize that they are a partner in your application. But yes, you can claim those other policies. That foundation will need to make sure and provide those documents to us at a later point. Yes, they can use those.
So if you have an organization that has events on city property, should it be the organization that applies for the Sprint grant, or should it be the city that applies?
So it will kind of come down to how that agreement is set up with you and the city. So if you are the only person allowed to use that property as an organization with the city's permission, you'll need to provide documentation to us to show us that, and then the organization can apply. If the city leases that space out to whomever needs to use it outside of your organization, then that will need to come from the city.
So do you have any other tips on what needs to be included in a budget if they're not using the budget template that you provide?
I would just say be as thorough as you can. Show all of your line items for your different budget budget requests. You can use ours as a guide, but you can also make it to where you're just kind of calculating up all of your construction costs versus your non-construction costs. You can make edits to that document and then send it in and make it completely different, but using ours as the framework, that's fine too. But yeah, you really want to make sure you line item and list out kind of section by section or phase by phase what your individual requests are going to look like. And we'll get to the budget document. Oh, that's okay. We'll get to the budget document here in just a few minutes.
Okay. Couple of questions on eligibility. Is museum master planning and exhibit planning an acceptable use of funds?
It would be somewhat permissible, but I'm not quite sure how you could spend $500,000 on that. I'm sure someone could in a very creative manner. So that most likely wouldn't come as an entire application. That should just be a component of it, but not, it would be allowed if it was a component, but not an entire application for just planning.
What about a tennis facility?
So if it was just a general tennis court and in a city park, then that wouldn't be permitted. But if you were renovating or building a paid tennis facility that allows for tournaments to come in, semi-pro or pro tournaments to come into your city, and that was maintained and operated for that manner, then that would be permitted, but not just a tennis court on a park. No.
This is kind of a specific question, but if the project is a proven corridor tourism collaboration and some or of the tourism properties is owned by the city and the city received base, does that one property need to be excluded?
Yes.
As far as the bidding process, can they utilize design build?
Yes, they can.
Is there a file size limit for a single file or a total max size?
I want to say, and it might show when we go into the application, I want to say it's like 20 megabytes, but I could be wrong, like per section. So it might be like 1 meg per file, but I think it might even be higher than that. We'll take a look when we go into the application.
Then there's on the pro forma expenditure section, bid from company for the same product. Do we submit both with the application, even if the expenditure estimate is different?
Let me see. This is the last question on the feasibility study.
Yeah,
Okay. So if we have a feasibility
on the
study,
feasibility study, yeah.
okay, with allowances for a specific area, but a 6-month-old bid.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think I combined two questions.
That's okay.
together.
Yeah, I'll
Yeah,
address,
sorry.
I'll address that, that one, the feasibility study. So
Yeah.
if you have a feasibility study with allowances for like HVAC, but you also have a 6-month-old bid from a company for HVAC, do you submit them both? And even if they're different, you can submit both. You can submit just one or the other, as long as that feasibility study is conducted by a reputable source and not your own estimates. Like, it needs to have some sort of basis to it and some sort of reference to some sort of outside source that's doing that feasibility study, but that can be done. It's up to you which one you want to. If one comes in at higher than the other and you think it might end up being more towards the higher end, then I would submit the higher amount, but it's your choice. You don't have to do both.
And then I think there's a question on the budget. Are you looking for a breakout per year of the project?
So the pro forma expenditure section, that is different than the budget. So the budget is your grant application budget. If you're going to ask for 2 million, we want to see where that 2 million is going to. Your pro forma expenditure section is after those 2 years of the grant being done, and you've got the progress taken care of. You'll then need to put in a 5-year projection of income versus expenses of your facility. So for example, if you have a museum and you expanded the footprint of that museum by, say, 10,000 square feet, and you're making already X number of dollars on the 30,000 square feet you have, you could make an estimate to say, okay, I'm increasing my footprint by 30%. Is it likely that my income will increase by 30% over those next 5 years? Or my expenses, will those also increase because I have more utilities and more electricity being used and all of the things, more facility space that you're renting out for income? All of those things will play into a part of that. So that's kind of the looking forward 5 years, not the budget and the line items for your grant. I think we have a question.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, if your
That's
bids
okay.
are more than 6 months old, should they rebid those?
You don't have to. I would recommend trying to get as most recent and up-to-date bids as you can, but with the short period of time that we have before this program closes, we'll accept those bids that are 6 months old or even a little older if they have to be. That way you're not having to scramble to try to get those new bids. And you can always, in your budget, and we have this in our template as well, if your bid comes in at, say, for HVAC at $40,000, there's a line item in the budget that allows you to add a contingency. That is no more than 10% of the total cost of your grant. So if you're going to request 2 million, you can request up to 200,000 as a line item for contingency. That can be used as your overages in case you have an older bid that might have an out of date price.
Okay, I think your last question here, if they include something in this bid that is ineligible, um, as a part of their overall project, will they be notified that that part is ineligible, or will the entire project be deemed ineligible?
Your entire project will not be deemed ineligible. So if we come out and we approve it, but we only approve it because 75% of it was eligible, and we can, and if in that situation we can award the full 75%, we will notify you in your award letter and then subsequent discussions about what was and was not permitted in your budget. You'll be submitting a revised budget to us based off of your final grant amount. And then once that's rectified and we've got all of the approvals for those uses of those funds, then we'll have that as part of your award agreement, so that you and I are all of us are on the same page as to what's allowed and what was not permitted for your final use of funds with your award agreement.
All right, Jonathan, I think we made it through all the questions.
All right, well, we still got 20 minutes just about. So I'm going to switch over here real quick. I want to go to the website here to show everybody what to look for when you're on here. So this is the kansascommerce.gov/sprint. And this will take you to our main page that shows all of the information that we have on here for the program. This button, we're going to change color because we're going to have some more buttons on here after today's presentation is recorded and we have the slides. So we'll probably make this stand out some way, green or orange or something. If you click on Apply Online, it'll take you to the Kansas Department of Commerce's website for submissions. This is called Submittable. You will log in, and then once you read through again all of the information on your application, all the guidelines are on there, you'll actually get to start putting in all of your data. So a lot of you have already started, and that's great. So if you have questions on anything, sometimes you'll get an error, or your bottom of your screen will just kind of spin, or it'll say apply and it won't say confirmed. You will get an email that once you've clicked apply, you'll get a confirmation email. If you don't receive that, you need to go back into your Submittable account with your login, username, and password. And that's how you can check to make sure that it went through. Excuse me. If you have someone that is helping you with the application, you can click Manage Collaborators right up here after you log in, and you can add people to assist you with your application. So if you're going to do one part and a colleague of yours is going to work on the budget and another one's going to work on the business, the pro forma and 5-year expenses, you can all do that. Whomever starts the application is the only one who can actually hit submit, though. So when you're going into the application, you'll see here's the multiple choice for where you're going to choose what your entity is. Your funding request, and again, 500,000 to 10 million is your limits. And then we just ask for the property information, where it's located, who the project manager is. So that might be different if the project manager is not the same as the property owner, that's fine. Where you'll enter in that UEI number, your tax identification number, and then you'll start filling in your description and your scope. So in here, that's where we want to see all of the details of your request. What are you going to use the funds for? Why are you going to use them? What's it going to go to? You can even start talking about some of your budget items here. And your funding need, we want to see what else have you already tried applying for? Is this a brand new project and you've maybe done a couple of other grant requests and they weren't successful? Or maybe they were, and you've got, let's say, an $8 million project and you're requesting us to fulfill the last $2 million. Then talk in here about where that other 6 came from. We want to see why it is that you need this grant in this section here. The budget and narrative section, so you'll be able to upload 5 documents here. This can be your budget files and then a narrative that describes your budget and where everything is exactly going to be used. Your timeline document, your bids and estimates. So this does allow up to 20 files. I don't know if it has a file limit on it. It doesn't really say on here, but it does accept all different kinds of files. So if you need to put in photographs or PDF files, Word documents, anything that's going to show on there. Your project photos, we only need 10. We don't need any more than that. It doesn't serve you any better if you have 20 or 30 or 10. It won't make any difference. The photo section is not scored. It is only for us to have documentation of what your project looks like before the grant funds were awarded. This is where you'll upload your 5-year expense and pro forma and your 3 letters of support, and then your W-9 tax form here. And following that are all of your risk assessment questions. So Bridget, we want to go back to these chat questions before we get into the budget document.
Yeah, I think we have just a couple of them here. There's one about the letters of support. Can they include more than 3?
It won't make any difference if you include more than 3, even if you combine them all into one document. 3 is better than 1, I will tell you that in terms of the scoring, but more than 3 is no better than 3.
Can you start the application and then keep coming back?
Yes, you can.
Yeah.
So at the
Yeah.
very bottom, you can click Save Draft. You can go back a day or a week later and come back and finish it. That's fine. And I'll just kind of show you here. If you click Apply and you don't have everything in, it's going to push you back up to the top. And all of these red sections that don't have any documentation or anything entered into them, because they're required, that's going to show you what you're still missing. So just because you hit apply doesn't mean it's actually done. You need to make sure that you'll get a confirmation screen and an email.
All right, great. If a project has a projected budget of several $1 million, is it recommended to request funding for the full amount or simply a portion of the project?
So that's kind of a 2-part answer on that. One is that a large amount of funding request is going to be looked at in terms of, what we have available for the funds and the program. We have $30 million. The state parks are also a part of this program and are entitled to apply just as anyone else. And they very well could be granted a large portion of this. So that makes the overall applications even more competitive. I will just give my suggestion here, and this is just my opinion. Take it as it for what you want. I would be surprised if, other than the state parks, if applications were approved for the larger cities in the state at anywhere over 3 to 5 million. The medium and smaller size cities, those are most likely going to be in a smaller than $3 million approval. It doesn't mean that that's going to be the case necessarily. That is just my best guess. But you will be able to have the opportunity to, if we have to reduce your request, put in for everything that you think you need, and then we will, cut as we can if we need to. But be mindful of, there are probably going to be several hundred applications coming in for this program.
Can there be more than one type of organization in your facility? I'm not 100% sure what that question is. You might know more than me.
It might mean something along the lines here on the top. So like if you are, let's say, for example, a city or a county, or you have a city county museum, it makes no difference. You can really just choose whichever one would work best. If you have more than one applying, you can just kind of, one of you will be the lead and one of you will be the supporting entity. You'll have to make a decision on who's going to be in charge of administering the funds. Whoever is not, make that one of your letters of support.
And they're just, I think, confirming that the picture section is for current pictures of the site, or is it for conceptual design drawings?
It can be either or both.
Okay. There's a question on the audit question. A 2021 audit with unmodified opinion. Is that a no or a yes?
So if the audit hasn't completed, or if it's close to being completed, you can say yes, that it has been taken care of. If it's got an unmodified opinion, I would just say that if you have started the audit process for 21, or you have it's unfinished, then you go ahead and mark that yes.
Will there be any awards less than $500,000 under Sprint?
No.
And are grants from the Kansas Creative Arts Commission or from the State Historical Society, are those considered as part of the federal grant process?
It'll depend on the specific grant, but none of those would make you ineligible to apply.
Okay, I
If
think
if that's a reference also, because there's a risk assessment question. Have you ever managed federal grants before? Check with your grant, the granting agency, just to see if those dollars were originally federal or if they were state dollars. If they were originally federal and went through the state, then those are still considered federal grants, and you can mark yes on that.
okay, I think that's it on the questions.
Okay, so the last thing before we have run out of time here, I'll just show real quick the on the website here for the Sprint page. If you go down to the very bottom, you'll see a sample application button. This is just a PDF version of what we just went through, so you can print this out and start working on it if you need to. The other option here is the sample budget. So if you go to this and click download Excel spreadsheet, it's going to pull up this Excel spreadsheet of your budget document that we have, you can use if you need to. So I would recommend going kind of left to right on the tabs here, putting in your title, what you want to call your project, your organization. This is just a cover sheet. It's not that important. What you will want to put in here, though, to make sure, is your requested amount. If you want to leave this blank until until you know how much it is you're going to ask for, that's fine. If you want to just put in here, you're going to ask for $1 million, you can do that. You can move over to the next tab. Your budget summary is going to show your Sprint funds here at $1 million, and then this will be your breakdown of your budget. These are auto-populated, so you don't need to edit anything on this sheet. The big button you want to go to and really work on is the budget narrative tab. So on here are pre-populated, and these can be changed if you need to, tasks that are considered construction or non-construction. Now,
Jonathan, they're not able to see the Excel spreadsheet.
Oh my gosh, I am so sorry.
Yeah,
That is my mistake. I apologize. So, okay, I will start over on here. So when you go to the Excel spreadsheet from the website, you'll get this cover sheet here, and you'll want to work from left to right on the tabs. You'll fill in just your basic information. You don't have to have all this on here. This is just, again, a cover sheet. You will eventually want to put in a requested amount on here, because this is going to reconcile and calculate everything up after you enter in all of your expenses. But you can leave this blank until you know how much your expenses are total. So for example, we'll put in $1 million. We'll click budget summary. It carries over to the budget summary tab here, and you can see the $1 million there. Once you start putting in your narratives, this is where your dollars are going to actually start calculating up. So you go to the budget narratives tab. You'll have tasks that you can drop down that are categorized here on generally accepted construction activities. If you don't have, and a lot of you don't, and I've seen this, if your estimate doesn't split up labor and materials, you can just use labor, or you can just use materials. It makes no difference. But you can just use, and we'll just use labor for here, and we'll just type in from whoever provided your quote. So we'll just say this was ABC Construction, and the purpose was for walls and demolition. You're going to request, this number will be based off of the estimates you got from your contractor. So for ABC, let's say in this example, gave us a $250,000 request. So it's going to add up here at the bottom for your construction costs. You can then put in another, let's say we've got some site work. This is also done by ABC. This is for ground moving, and we'll say that this was 100,000. Then we'll go down to the non-construction costs. So again, these are generally accepted categories. However, not all of these are going to be allowed. These were just auto-populated from previous grant programs. So salaries and programming, those are the salaries are not permitted. So salaries for your staff aren't. The salaries for the labor costs, those are allowed, of course, but salaries are not. But let's say you have some insurance that you need for the construction, and that was $50,000, and you got that quote from State Farm. And you've also got your inspection fees, and we'll just make this very easy and say that these are $600,000. They won't be, hopefully, but that's what you could budget if you've got it documented. And we'll say that's from the city of Sunflower. So you have your tabs in here filled out for all of your expenditures. If you go into and you've made sure you've selected a drop down, you've got your dollar amount in here, you go to the construction budget tab. These will automatically populate anything that's construction related. You can have more than one. So if you know you're going to have labor for one building is from one contractor and another one is going to be from another, it'll add all of those up. This is where you can also enter in your contingencies. So we can't do more than 10% of the $350,000 for construction. So we'll just say we want to have a $20,000 contingency. That's for your overages. Then we'll go to the non-construction. So we've got $50,000 for insurance and $600,000 for inspection fees. And we'll just say we'll do a $50,000 contingency for here. So you have all of that entered in, you go back to your summary and it's added into your amount. So we actually, with the contingencies, went over the budget. So we can go back to our cover sheet and say we actually need $1,070,000. And now it's balanced. That's how you'll put in your amounts. It also gives you a check down here to make sure that your total contingency isn't more than 10%. So your contingency you asked for were 70, 100,000 here. The last part of this spreadsheet is a timeline tab. So this is where you're going to put in all of your expenditures based off when they're going to be used over the next 2 years. This is totally something you can use if you want to. It's fully customizable. You don't have to, there's no formulas other than just it adds up the total down here where it says total Sprint dollars. So if you want to break down your construction versus non-construction costs, or you can just change this to say phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, you'll put in here what you're estimating on what your quarter by quarter spend is. For me and for us, when we review your expenditures in your timeline, this is going to give you very detailed information and provide to us not only what's going to get done, but when and how it's going to be paid for. It also allows you to show in what your previous expenditures come from, so that you know if you've got those allowable expenditures dating back to July 1st, you can, add those in here so you can show where the rest of your funds are going to go. I know it's a lot, it's very fast. I apologize for that, but we are getting a little short on time. I'm guessing the majority of these questions back up in here are people who couldn't see the Excel spreadsheet. So I apologize for that.
Can you show them, there were a couple of questions on how they got to this page, the Excel page. Can you show that again real quickly?
Yes, I will. So if you go to the Sprint website, kansascommerce.gov/sprint, and you scroll all the way down to the very bottom, you'll see sample application and sample budget. And the sample budget, you can just click to download the Excel spreadsheet.
Okay, just a couple quick questions while we have a couple of minutes left. Can labor and materials cost and budget request, can that come from their own employees?
No, it cannot.
Okay. Is there any chance that the application due date could be extended?
Unfortunately not. It is, we have put in a request to have it extended. We have had multiple requests for that from members of the public. At this time, it's not being extended. If it does, we will be issuing out some emails to anyone who has questions on this, or as well as social media, and we'll make a very large announcement on the website if it is extended. But it is very
insurance. Is insurance an allowable expense?
Yes, it is. If it's insurance for the construction, not for the facility, but for the construction, like the liability insurance that the contractor is going to need, that can be put on here as an allowable cost. Yes.
And I think you answered this one earlier, but about, do they have to use the budget spreadsheet, or can they use what is submitted by the builder?
They can use what's submitted by the builder. The one thing I did want to go back and just show real quick in case this makes this easier. So if you recall, these drop downs here, these are actually just pulled from these two tabs. So construction and non-construction. So if you have something else like an installation, or I know there was a question about like the utilities and electricity that has to be extended, you can add those in here. So if I wanted to say, because we can't use salaries for internal staff or operating, but you can put in here if you've got utilities that need to be extended. It's not the utilities for the building. It's not the ongoing utilities, but if it's that utility work that needs to be done, you can either put that, you would probably put that in construction, but however you make a change to it, if you need to, if you go back after you update that tab, the drop down is updated. So now it says utilities here instead of salaries.
Okay, there is some questions. I think you answered this maybe earlier about if they have older estimates, how to account for that, or should they go and get new estimates?
Try to get as new as you can, but if you can't get new estimates, then I would recommend putting the estimate that you have in, because at least it's documented, and then adding in to wherever it's relevant, a contingency. So you can add in, 10% on top of that if you can. You don't have to document the contingency, but if you have an older quote for, let's say, 50,000 and the materials have gone way up since then, but that's the only quote you have, then add in some contingency dollars to help with that.
Should they add in all previous expenditures for this project, or only the ones that they are requesting funding for?
Only the ones they're requesting funding for. Very good question.
Okay. So is the bidding process expenses, are they legal under non-construction and a permissible expense?
So the bidding process, that if you have someone else assisting you with that, so grant administration costs are not allowed, but if you have a consultant that is assisting you with administering the funds as well as administering the bids, then that consulting charge is permitted. But the administering of the actual funds and your application and your award, that cannot be part of your allowable expenses. But we do have there is a consulting section here for your fund request. If you want to have that in as for someone to assist you and that you pay, again, if that is over 5,000, they will also have to bid on that as well too.
And then there's a couple of questions here about like if electric has to be expended and the city's electric department will do it since it's in a city park, is that expense fundable? And then also kind of the same thing, we have an estimated cost for some lighting work that needs to be done, but not necessarily labor because they've done it internally. Are those acceptable costs?
So we'll go to the first one. If the electric has to be extended and the city has to pay for that, the city can request, if you are a separate entity from that city, let's say you're a zoo and you're on your own property, but in order to get the work done, the electricity has to be run up there and the city is going to charge you for that. That's part of the infrastructure, that's labor and materials, or you can make that a utilities line item. That's your choice, but yes, that is allowable.
Okay, last question about in-kind gifts.
No, so it has to be actual items that you expensed and not in-kind gifts to be reimbursed.
If they have 5 projects in their request, do they need to do a budget template sheet for each project? Or is it one for each one? Okay.
You can do one request. You can do one request to have all of those as different line items. And you can just say, for example, in that section that said the use, you can say building 1, labor and materials, building 2, utilities, building 3, groundwork. You don't have to have separate budgets for each building. You can do one master budget. That's perfectly fine.
So I think some of these might be real specific. The audit question, I would encourage you to reach out to Jonathan directly on that, just to be sure that do they need to show the in-kind gifts?
No, that's not required.
Okay. I think we've gotten through the majority of them, Jonathan. There might be some, if you didn't get your questions answered, I encourage you to reach out to Jonathan directly to get those, and I'll let you wrap it up.
All right, well, thank you very much, Bridget. I'm going to go back here real quick and go to the last slide. Oops, I apologize. 1 second here, a little too fast. So if you do have questions, please feel free to reach out. You can reach out to me via phone or email, commercespark@ks.gov or 620-615-2409. Text and phone calls are perfectly fine. After 11:59 p.m. on February 27th, we will not be able to have any discussion on any applications or make any changes to those. So anything you have issues with, if you're having an issue with submittable, if you're having an issue with your application or an attachment's not working, you need to reach out as early as you can and let me know. Do not wait until 11:45 p.m. on that evening, because I might not answer my phone. Probably will, but I might not. But with that, thank you all very much for your patience, and appreciate your interest, and very much looking forward to having your applications in, and best of luck to all of you. And thank you very much, Bridget, for helping out tonight or today.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Have a good day, everyone.